welcome to Snippit Sports Science Podcast. This is Jared Coleman-Start, today with Luke McDonald, first author of the paper, Mindfulness Training Attenuates the Increase in Salivary Cortisol Concentration Associated with Competition in Highly Trained Wheelchair Basketball Athletes. How are you doing today, Luke?
I'm great, thanks, Jared. How are you?
Pretty well. Can you tell us a little bit about this article? Where did it come from? How did you guys get the idea for the study?
Yeah, sure. So my PhD was looking at the effects of mindfulness training on markers of cognition, stress, and immune function in athletes, specifically team sport athletes.
Yep.
I started my PhD wanting to understand how mindfulness might affect cognition, but after a while I started to look into research that may have found where it affects physiology as such, and I kept coming across how it affects stress, and we've obviously, with the creation of the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which is heavily used in clinical populations, there's obviously a strong link between using mindfulness to reduce stress, and obviously our physiological stress marker is cortisol.
Right.
I wanted
Big one. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a little bit of clinical research out there, some sporting research, but very little. So I wanted to understand how it affects cortisol, and then, as you know, during competition, often we have problems with maintaining an athlete's immune function because they're obviously, with heavy competition, at risk of illness and injury. So I want to investigate how it affects salivary immunoglobulin A. So obviously one of our main mucosal immune markers.
Yeah, I think it's basically our largest, best marker for immune function. I think one of the most consistent, reliable ones that we've had is the salivary IgA.
Exactly.
Right. So you got wheelchair basketball athletes. They're in competitions. They get very stressed. We can see that in an increase in cortisol, our main kind of biomarker for stress. And then on the back of stress, there's often decrease in that salivary IgA, showing that they have a compromised immune system.
Exactly.
Right.
Sure.
And then that puts them at increased risk of infections like upper respiratory tract infection and so on.
Sure. Exactly.
So what'd you do? Where'd you get the athletes and how'd you conduct the study?
About halfway through my PhD, I joined the Queensland Academy of Sport, the Centre of Excellence program for applied sports science research, and they put me in contact with different QAS sports. And it just so happened that initially I wanted case study athletes for this study, and my first case study athlete was the captain of the Australian women's wheelchair basketball team.
Oh, cool.
And I introduced it to her. She said to me, "Have you spoken to our coach about this? He'd be very interested. One of the things that we're trying to work on is maintaining focus during games."
Right.
So he'd be very keen to hear about it. Sure enough, I met up with the coach at the time, and within a few weeks, we had the whole QAS squad, wheelchair basketball squad, wanting to partake in the study. And also the coaches really wanted them to do it as well. And then all of a sudden I had 16 athletes, randomized them into two groups. From looking at previous research as well as my own experiences with mindfulness training throughout my PhD and some of the studies I conducted in rugby union, I wanted to complete an intensive program with the athletes and also look at obviously cortisol and immune function, but at a time when I knew that there would be some changes in those markers. So obviously
competition.
Exactly.
Yeah. Big stimulus.
Yep. So what we typically see is, as you said before, we see an increase in cortisol, and if they're undergoing a period of heavy competition and training, often that's chronically elevated, and we know that with chronically elevated levels of cortisol is strongly correlated with overtraining syndrome and overreaching. So, and also that we referred to before, that with low salivary IgA concentrations, we see athletes being more susceptible to illnesses such as upper respiratory tract infection. So we got them at a perfect time during their year where they were completing a lot of heavy training and competition, and we pretty much slotted in over the top of regular training competition an 8-week intervention for 8 of the athletes. The first 2 weeks of the intervention was purely an introductory program where it worked out to be roughly about 10 to 12 minutes of mindfulness training about 5 times a week.
Yeah, I've heard that 15 minutes is the easiest to comply with. And most people are happiest to do about 15 minutes when they're getting started.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the shorter the better during that initial period. You're going to have a lot of distractions if you try and put yourself through like a 45 or hour-minute meditation, hour presentation. meditation. The athletes in the mindfulness group, what's called the mindfulness group, they had no prior experience in meditation, so they needed that 2 weeks. And then after 2 weeks, they went into what we call the intensive period, which was 6 weeks. They completed a 45-minute meditation, as well as roughly about 5 to 8 minutes of mindfulness exercises 5 times.
So what's the difference between meditation versus the exercises?
Right, so if we consider those athletes as naive meditators,
right, because none of them had meditated at all, which is pretty cool that you've got a completely meditation naive population.
Exactly, yeah, it was great. So the meditation really at that point in time just has one main focal point, and that being the breath.
Right.
And that present breath. So if you think about it as though you're just practicing your breathing, it might be focusing on that breath then, and then again now, and then breathing again now, and then so on and so forth. You get the picture.
Right.
And then the guided meditations will often go off into thinking about sort of the feelings in your body and the noises that you're hearing in your surroundings. So you may have heard of the body scan. Yeah. Whereas with the exercises the athletes were doing, they completed things like mindfulness, mindful eating, mindful listening, even completing activities at home like doing the dishes and practicing being mindful and present in that moment in terms of what they were doing. All of those exercises and guided meditations were taken from the Smiling Mind application.
Okay, so this is a smartphone application.
It is a smartphone application.
And that's quite common in your research, isn't it? You kind of combine interventions with technological methods of doing it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it worked out very easy through the application because it was something that the athlete could have on them at any time on their phone. They could do this anywhere they wanted. I mean, at one point the athletes were traveling overseas, right, and they were able to complete the meditation when they were sitting on the plane.
Yeah, perfect. Good place to meditate, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, chill out a little bit in the 8-hour flight.
Sure. Yeah, concentrating or focusing on those noises around you, like a baby crying, or learning to accept that's actually happening, and
there's just nothing anyone can do about it.
Yeah, and just move on and be present, and won't get you as stressed, and maybe you'll have a better time on the flight.
Exactly. That's quite an extraordinary population of athletes that you were able to gather. Almost the entire state plus level wheelchair basketball athletes.
Sure.
It's very rare to get that sort of population.
It is very rare. And considering the population, I think the athletes that they are really had an effect on how well they completed the intervention.
Right.
I mean, it is fair to say that athletes with disabilities have probably a few more things to overcome in life than what, say, an able-bodied athlete does.
It's a stressful life.
Yeah. And their perseverance with training and travel and everything. And let's also consider that some of these athletes often experience pain as well to do with their previous injury or disability. So their determination was shown in that I actually put an 85% attrition rate on this study. So any athlete that was not completing above 85% of the intervention was left out of the study. And I actually didn't have to do that to any of the athletes. All athletes completed the study. I think one of the athletes completed the intervention to 90%, and that was the worst.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you're measuring them over an 8-week period, and you had a 2-week follow-up.
Yes.
So, because there was such high compliance, did they continue the mindfulness training during their 2-week on their own?
No. So they were strictly told that at the end of the 8-week intervention, they had to stop.
Yes.
Now, obviously, there are things that we can't control. So athletes did tell me throughout the intervention that using the skills they'd learned from the intervention, they're able to get themselves off to sleep a lot easier and focus on listening to someone at that present time and with study and work and so on. So I can't control their inherent learning and themselves to just automatically select that learnt skill to better focus on something. But there was the strict instruction to not use the app until after the study was completed. During the 8 weeks, it sort of fitted nicely so that the 8 weeks sat right on top of a 7-week period of heavy competition and training. So if you think about 8 weeks sitting on 7 weeks, the intervention started about 3 days before they went into what we call the competition period, and it finished about 3 days after. And every 2 weeks during the study, we measured salivary IgA and also salivary cortisol. So that obviously happened at baseline and at 2-week increments throughout the competition period. and also at that 2-week follow-up period. So again, their last competition or last weekend of competition occurred 3 days before that final or that second last testing of saliva. So regardless of the intervention, we did expect to see a drop-off in their cortisol.
Right.
And we were hypothesizing that we would see an increase in IgA at that as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the coach was quite interested in increasing focus in the athletes. Is that for generalized gameplay, or is that for specific skills like free throwing?
I would say that probably both.
Yeah.
One of the things that hindsight's a wonderful thing with this, in that during the intervention period, the coach said to me, reported that he was seeing improvements, the athletes' attentiveness and focus during training as a whole.
Right. And
also during games. One of the things that I did also start to track throughout that time period was looking at different game stats from the athletes and seeing if I could see a mild improvement there. I didn't find anything that we could probably use and report in a study.
Right.
However, I did publish a paper where the athletes completed an evaluation after the mindfulness intervention, just explaining how they felt the mindfulness intervention affected them in any way.
Right. More qualitative answers to tease out the things that is very hard to assess with the sort of typical quantitative studies that we do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the athletes reported that she had improved game free throw percentage during the last few weeks of the intervention.
Yeah.
I had a look at her game stats, and there is a slight trend in improvement. So I guess that's probably measurable. From a statistical standpoint, probably not.
But as a case study for one elite athlete, for us, we work in very small numbers. Most other people look at our sample sizes of 16 or whatever it is, and they think it's a small sample size.
Exactly.
But it's approaching 100% of the target population. And when it's a single athlete that can make a difference in terms of medal count or winning the game, that's what we really care about.
It is pretty big, yeah.
Yeah.
As you said, when we're dealing with elite athletes, it's hard to get a sample size that might make the results statistically significant. But when in the elite sport setting, when there's one athlete and they're improving their performance, well, it's very, very worthwhile.
Absolutely. So coming back to those quantitative measures, what do you find in the cortisol and SIGA?
In the control group, we saw a pretty typical response in cortisol. So from baseline to the, let's call it 2 weeks into the intervention and 1.5 weeks into that competition period, we saw a significant increase in cortisol from baseline to 2 weeks, and it remained significantly elevated compared to baseline for the rest of the intervention period, and then dropped off at that end of intervention measure, which was a few days after the competition period finished.
So that competition period was quite stressful.
Exactly. Yeah. And what is also worth mentioning is we measured cortisol midweek at rest.
Yeah.
All right. So we were looking at trying to understand if there was a chronic elevation in cortisol, because we know that cortisol is very, very sensitive to change and to stressor or stimulus. So making sure that we got them at rest during that period. In the mindfulness group, their cortisol level significantly increased from baseline to 2 weeks. Now, if we think about that from the intervention side of things, so that was when they were completing their introductory period of the mindfulness intervention. So we saw a significant increase, but then at 4 weeks, it had significantly decreased when comparing 2 weeks to 4 weeks. And it was no different to baseline at 4 weeks, again at 6 weeks, again at the end of the intervention, and then again at 2 week follow-up.
Okay. And there's a really great figure in the paper. I'd encourage listeners to open up the paper and have a look at it, because the figure really expresses quite clearly the difference in sort of that area under the curve between the mindfulness group versus the non-mindfulness group.
Yeah, that was a bit of a struggle trying to illustrate that as best as possible and indicating the competition period. I actually had some tips when I presented this at European Conference of Sport Science a couple of years ago. So thanks to that person in the crowd that helped me with that.
And then what were you finding with the salivary IgA?
So interestingly, what we saw in this salivary IgA concentrations in both groups is we saw a significant increase from baseline to 2 weeks in both groups, and their IgA remained significantly elevated at 4 weeks, so the middle of the intervention, again at 6 weeks, and it decreased to a level no different to baseline at the end of the intervention and also post 2 weeks. So it's almost as though the training and competition was a beneficial stimulus on their mucosal immune function up until probably about 6 weeks into the competition period. And then we saw that drop off at the end of intervention. So maybe indicating that when they were heading into that back end of that competition, that's when things really became potentially stressful, and then that therefore affected them with respect to their immune function. We saw it was quite low at the end of the entry period.
Right. So they were getting stressed going into the competition period, but it was only really becoming overloading towards the end of the season, which I think a lot of people would relate to. At the beginning of the season, it's stressful, but you're excited, everything's going well, and it's by the end of that competition season where you really start to feel a bit run down.
Yeah, I think so. I think you probably nailed it there, Jared. I mean, I remember saying in the paper that it's possible that the competition period was not intense enough to elicit a decrease in the rate of IgA secretion. Definitely intense enough to obviously elicit an increase in cortisol. But as you were saying, maybe it was something to do with that sort of overload during the end of that competition period that was the cause of that drop off in IgA that we saw at the end of the period.
All right. Do you pull any other conclusions from any of that data? Because largely we see that the competition period was very stressful, but that the mindfulness training was able to attenuate some of that stress, as you saw in the cortisol, but then slight differences in those immune responses where it looks like they weren't actually getting immune compromised. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So you were finding that the mindfulness training was attenuating that increase in the cortisol during the competition period. What do you think are some of the mechanisms behind that?
Previous clinical studies have highlighted the neurological benefits of mindfulness training on brain regions associated with attention regulation, body awareness, and emotion regulation. So just delving deeper into that, these studies have shown after 8-week interventions, as little as 8-week interventions, increases in brain activity in those regions, but also morphological changes. So increases in cortical thickness and grey matter density in those brain regions. A study in 2011 by Holtzel and Lazar et al., they reported that those mechanisms, attention regulation, body awareness, and emotion regulation, they work synergistically to develop one's increased self-regulation. So it can kind of be postulated that mindfulness training potentially caused neurological benefits in these wheelchair basketball players that resulted in an attenuation of their stress response, i.e. cortisol, during that competition period. So if we think about that from a psychological standpoint or like a psychophysiological standpoint, mindfulness training may provide an individual, or in this case these athletes, with a self-regulatory process, an ability to objectively reappraise stresses, things like training, physical and psychological, things that happen in everyday life, whether they've had an argument with their partner, whether they're stuck in traffic, whatever it is. By objectively reappraising those stresses, they thereby downregulate their own psychophysiological stress response when we're talking about that hypothalamic pituitary axis from the brain top down that elicits that increase in cortisol concentration. Now, admittedly, we didn't or weren't able to measure what was actually happening in the brain, but that's what we're assuming based on previous clinical research and neuroscientific research that that's probably what was happening.
Yeah, I've seen some studies on like meditative monks and whatnot, and that just their neurological structure is just completely different from people who haven't been meditating for 8 hours a day for 10 years. It does actually quite extreme changes to the brain, and that they have an incredible change in the activation of those structures as well.
Exactly.
So they'll put a fMRI on them and they'll tell them to meditate on happiness or something. Just the switch in the functional imaging is extraordinary.
And the maintenance or the ability to maintain that high activity in those areas for long periods of time and maintain that present moment awareness.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Glute. Thanks for coming in. And thank you, listeners. Please visit our website at snippetscience.com or follow us on Twitter at snippetscience. Thank you.